Welcome to the Supplier Diversity and Inclusion Podcast by Fips Consulting. In this podcast, I speak with international guests who share their experience on supplier diversity and inclusion. Today, I get the pleasure to speak with Lisa Westgate, CEO and founder of LN Westgate. Lisa, it's great to have you as my guest today.
Thank you so much. It's so good to see you, Andrea.
So Lisa and I have known each other for a while. We only met face-to-face the first time a couple of months ago. So, Lisa, can you share what LN Westgate is doing?
So we are a procurement consulting firm. So we assist businesses in creating efficient programs around their procurement teams. Something that is near and dear to my heart is really community-based procurement, which is based on impactful sourcing and driving community-based procurement initiatives. We have a lot of changes that are happening here in the United States, and I believe that procurement drives a fundamental role in ensuring that small business doesn't turn into the next main streets of our country.
Yeah, so Lisa and I have been partnering for supplier diversity and inclusion trainings and education sessions for the past years. And we had a conversation with Kathy Perna from ISM about supplier diversity and inclusion in the US and in Europe. So since Lisa is located in the US and I'm located in Switzerland, we talked about the differences between how supplier diversity and inclusion is lived and experienced in the US compared to Europe. And that was in January 2024. And I would love to talk to you about this again and really talk about what has changed since then.
So much. So much has changed since January of 2024. But really from a procurement perspective, what we're seeing is the anti-DEI language that's happening here in the United States has really caused a little bit of havoc, if you will, in regards to how CPOs are and category managers are really thinking about building out their discovery process. And Andrea, as you know, it riles me up a little bit when we start talking about this. But I just truly believe that procurement has a fundamental responsibility in recognizing that if we want to use the language merit based, procurement has been merit based since the beginning of procurement. Nowhere in time have we created or impacted procurement in a way that said, we will make choices based on a certification over what is right for a business. And somehow we've allowed the conversation to get away from us. And we've allowed the conversation to say, somehow going with a small business, going with a diverse business is less than. And it's the less than that is so problematic. And, this is where I do a lot of speeches across the country here. And what I beg people to think about is stand up for discovery, right? How we find suppliers, that's really what the intention of supplier diversity was. It is ensuring that there's a seat at the table. And I am not in any way talking about, I'm going to send out 5 RFPs and have one diverse supplier. I'm going to give a 20% chance that they're going to, win or be awarded this contract. That's not a program either. There's a movement right now that talks about supplier diversity is not a program, that it's simply the principle of how we do business. How do we do business? We go out and we find suppliers who are going to bring the best price for the product, the service. They're going to pass all the risks requirements that are needed. They're going to, depending of course on the category, they're going to be able to do the best business for the best price with the least amount of risk. That's the goal, not sometimes 100% of the time. There's also, however, this additional layer, and I mentioned Main Street earlier. Here, we, the people of the United States, decided buying from, these big box companies and having our orders shipped to us the same day, the next day, was more important than what was happening down on Main Street. And this is the moment for us to think about is that if we are not giving consideration to the fact that Main Street went out of business because we, the retail buyers of the United States, chose comfort over getting up and going down to Main Street. When we stand and we go, oh, it's too bad about Main Street. It's 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 not too bad. We did this. We intentionally did this. Moment is now that we recognize if we're not recognizing small business, which here in the United States is far greater than large business by number, by revenue, if we're not consciously addressing the need to ensure that small business stay active and functioning and alive and part of our economy, we're in a heck of a bind in a short couple of years from now.
Yeah, going back to your first comments, supplier diversity and inclusion was always a door opener, an effort of inclusion to make sure that everybody gets a seat at the table. But at the end of the day, every business that you work with has to deliver a good product, good service, good price.
But I just want to jump on the word inclusion because I think that the word inclusion as it relates to procurement or as it relates to supply chain truly means, are you connecting, whatever your customer base is? And I'm not just talking about your individual customer, but when you go down the line for whoever you're selling, if you're, we can go to the right and go to our supplier N, and then all the way up the line until the final customer. Are people being represented in each one of those phases? Right? It's not about a transaction of I'm going to buy from my supplier and I'm going to pretend I don't know about the supplier N. I teach supply chain, and one of the things I talk about is, because I love McDonald's stories around on the potato farms. And so I always talk about, when you pull that potato out of the ground, if we are calling that supply N, all the way down to the final product that can be sold from that potato, that's the entire supply chain. How are you considering it? How are you thinking about it? And if I'm not represented in that potato transaction from, the 15, let's say there's 15 suppliers that are going to touch that, where's my representation? And why isn't it important for me to recognize that others need to be represented in the entirety of my supply chain? These are, forget the certification type. We are talking about humanity and just the flow of how things, you are as much a right to your feeling around my supply chain if you're a customer as I am as the next person, as the next person. All of the customers have to be comfortable and recognize that their dollars are impactful to their own individual communities, right? Because we're not all just one community. You and you're from Switzerland, I'm from Massachusetts in the United States, right? We are still of a similar community. And then we can, through intersectionality, we'll figure out where we're not. But for procurement, how do we figure out where we are? And how do we align those intersects so that they make sense and they're transparent and they're comfortable? And it seems as if we've allowed kind of this anti-DEI movement to take away the common sense of how the structure of ensuring that everything is a piece to the overall puzzle. The puzzle is not just, did you not use words that some group deems, distasteful? When you look at your supplier and you look at your final customer, how is that? And are you sourcing through the impact of inclusivity? That's really the key to this.
Right. And the thing is that the world is diverse. That's not going away, right? I think what we talked about in our webinar with ISM in January 2024 was that supplier diversity and inclusion was still at the very beginning in Europe, whereas it was advanced in the US. Now we're seeing this kind of going backwards in the US, but Europe is still going forward. I also see it, besides all the things that I think are not going well, there are still chances to maybe take a step back and look at what can be done differently, what can be done to create more impact especially in Europe, are also 99% of all the businesses in the EU are SMEs. So it's kind of the backbone of the European economy. And that also means to include small business, buy more local. We're facing all these reporting directives like CSRD, CSDDD, the UK Procurement Act, where you have to report on what you buy, where you buy it, how you buy it. And also the certification that has been really big in the US, especially if you had to report your numbers and publish your numbers. Is there also kind of a shift towards more, as you said, impact on communities rather than just the certified dollar amounts or percentages?
I think let's start with do I believe that there'll still remain certifying agencies and a need to identify women-owned, minority-owned, veteran, LGBT? I certainly hope so, right? Because what we measure grows. We know that. Peter Drucker told us that, in the 70s. And to think that we aren't going to pay attention to benchmarks and numbers doesn't make any sense because we are benchmark and number people. Everything we do is based on benchmarks and numbers, right? And if we have not built into our process, which we know we haven't, or there wouldn't be any room here for this pushback, right? So the only reason there can be a pushback and an anti-DEI movement is because fundamentally our procurement teams still have not integrated a supplier diversity program as part of their actions, as part of their policy, as part of their procedure. And because they didn't, we've now have this big space that says if we drive this from bias, we're going to still be able to remove those that haven't integrated into their system. So let's start with without certifications, without being able to identify literally the who's who and what's what of these organizations, we don't have any idea who it is. And if we don't have any idea, I am not going to take a stance in a biased world that everybody's doing the right thing, because what we're seeing here is that we are far from doing the right thing. And we know this again. I'm going to point back to Main Street 100% of the time. We had the chance to do what was right, and we put mom and pop businesses out of business in order to go and get our shipments the next day. Retail perspective. Business perspective, worse, right? The business perspective is worse. We as individuals, whether you buy sustainable for your home, whether I do, whether I buy from LGBT women-owned organizations, up to me personally. But what I know is I didn't do the right thing by going down to Main Street because I was part of the problem. So I don't point fingers when I talk about Main Street. I'm part of the problem. What I also recognize is I now recognize our ways and want to be part of the solution. So bringing it back to B2B, how can we anticipate, pretend, or ignore the fact that we're not a country, a planet, a world of people that are just simply going to do the right thing because we're going to do the right thing? It still comes back down to this one phrase. We certify people because they are in an underrepresented group and need a means to come to the table. Begins and ends there. So if we remove certification, what then happens? We have now no ability to discover these organizations because there's no mechanism in place, because the mechanism doesn't happen on its own, because we know this. We know this inherently. We know this over and over and over again. I feel sometimes like this is where I want to pull my hair out of my head, right? Like we're in this game of pretending that this bias isn't driving the need to demolish DEI, and that it should be, and it's the it should be that's the problem here, right? It doesn't just happen on its own. Okay, so there's a lot of words that I just threw out there. What am I saying? I'm saying I can't see certifications going away. I am screaming from the rooftops, we cannot let certification go away. Because if we let certification go away, we have no means to track this. And if we're not tracking it in what we have to recognize is the most biased moment in our country, my country, that there's no end of game that says, isn't this wonderful? Everybody's included. That's that's not where we're headed without at least we have this remaining tool that if we're all holding on to and working with, it will help that. And that's really the point of impactful sourcing. It's to ensure that as a CPO, you are driving the message that inclusive procurement, sustainable procurement is fundamental for your organization. And I talk about three pillars, right? Discovery, retention, and development. How are you finding suppliers? How are you retaining them? And how are you helping to develop them? And when we talk about supplier development, and it has, I was just recently in a conversation where I caught some bias I wasn't prepared for. And it was a handout, it was correlated to a handout to small businesses, supplier development. And I thought it just I don't understand that that is a handout where when we create two large organizations that are creating joint ventures and one is financing it more than the other, that that's a reasonable, good two big businesses doing a joint venture where here's a big business and a small business building out a development plan to ensure efficiency and working better. And that at the end of the day, you will have a stronger small business, but you will have a stronger customer who is a large business who, the benefits for the large organization in doing development or continuous improvement with small businesses is they understand the flaws and internal inefficiencies that they have within their own structure. And if done right, they're building improvement from beginning to end. It is not this imbalance. It appears that there is a view that looks at development of small businesses in a way that is out of proportion. It's mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Nepotism, cronyism, we see that, we recognize that it's in all business, but we appear to be that's acceptable form of business versus DEI. I just don't get it. I I've never heard of a business going under because of DEI. Nepotism and cronyism, I've seen, we both have seen over, hundreds of years we've seen organizations close due to cronyism and nepotism.
True. Yeah. I think the problem is just with DEI internally, but also in the supply chain, you don't really see an immediate revenue increase, which is kind of hard to sell internally with all the positive impacts that it can have on your business. Now, we have also seen lots of companies letting go of their supplier diversity teams
Yes.
due to the executive orders and so on. What do you think about that? Because when I look at it from Europe, very few companies actually have dedicated supplier inclusion, diversity, responsible sourcing teams. What we see more is chief sustainability officers, which cover the whole company, also including supply chain, but not really the dedicated teams. Whereas in the US, you had these big teams, which all were very engaged, but also connected within the company, within the business, to make sure that the whole business understands what supplier diversity and inclusion is compared to Europe, where you don't really have that too much and that visibility as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting though, and kind of alluded to it a few minutes ago, is that moment where we've allowed anti-DEI into the conversation because we as procurement professionals failed to bring the tool of supplier diversity of community-based procurement initiatives, uh, you know, into our fundamental policy and procedure. And because we didn't, we have continued to act as if it is a separate entity from procurement. Let me say, I love procurement. I've been in procurement for 30 years. I love procurement. To me, everything around a business begins and ends with procurement because there's nothing else at play. Maybe HR. I'll give HR there, right? Everything about an organization, everything that's in there was bought. Everything that's going out of there is part of the raw material that was brought in. We can pretend that's not the case, and we allowed that for years. Procurement has been fighting to get at the table. And now I feel like we're finally recognizing procurement, supply chain is what keeps the doors open. It is, right? I mean, and again, with people, I don't mean, I don't want to downplay people. As part of that process of how we did business, if we're not truly considering that sourcing aspect of discovery and recognizing the rules of sourcing and as we're in a, right now here in Massachusetts, we've got blizzards coming our way pretty soon, right? We have ships hitting bridges. We have, our I don't need to go through all the risks, right? But risk after risk after risk. If you're not looking at this global world and recognizing that your risks sometimes to mitigate them, you need to come as close to core as possible. It doesn't make any sense. And if you're thinking that close to core is not small and diverse businesses, missing you're missing the risk mitigation of how to work with small businesses. And I can hear people who are hearing this right now saying, well, I have a category I work for a company that's 200,000 people. True. That is really true. Intentional redundancy must be part of your plan, right? I'm not always talking about going with the mom and pop shop down the street in lieu of, your rawest material, in lieu of your mineral. And when we get caught in that conversation, it gets really like it's for naught, right? Because this is not big brushstrokes. That's the point. Procurement isn't big brushstrokes. But we do have fundamental processes that we follow. And ensuring that we are mitigating risk as much and as often as possible is heading into 26. I'm going to say the number one, to me, always is up there, right? So we'll say, oh, this is the year of price. We want better pricing. We want savings. Where next year we might think about risk. You need to be looking at risk right now, 100% of the time. And if I were a CPO and I don't care what the organization or industry is, I'm going to look at how do I mitigate my risk with the greatest number of redundancies. We pay for insurance for a lot of reasons. If you're not recognizing that some contracts with small businesses, they could be big business, local business, isn't an insurance and a risk mitigator, then you're not paying attention to what's happening around just the sheer number of risks associated. I believe the core answer to your question was because, your question was really about supplier diversity being a separate entity from procurement. And has that made sense? And I'm going to say, whatever and however the company is set up is how the company is set up. Supplier diversity, community-based procurement must be part of the actual transactions of your procurement team. So when I think about a supplier diversity office and I think about the people that are attending the events that you and I go to all the time, right? Who are we seeing? We should be seeing people who are out there and networking, and they're hearing about innovation, and they're hearing about that they're that one step for the category manager to, they should be, in my head, they're going back to the category manager in specific functions and saying, here's the new group of people that I brought. And this one has something to say about innovation, or this one has something to say, or we've got policy issues here in the United States, right? So, I want to know that the teams that I see out at these events, they're listening around the policy and they're bringing it back to their procurement team. I hope that answered your question.
Totally. So we talked about how does supplier diversity and inclusion look like in the US since January 2024. I think one of the main changes is also that it's in most cases not called supplier diversity anymore. It's either supplier inclusion, responsible sourcing, inclusive sourcing, buying with impact, and several other names. It's maybe the teams that are not really dedicated anymore, but supplier inclusion is still lived within a lot of companies. One thing that is also, from my point of view, a major change is that companies are not talking about their supplier inclusion targets or achievements anymore. So before we saw a lot of companies saying we want to, I don't know, we want to spend $1 billion with diverse owned businesses by 2030, throwing out these goals on supplier inclusion. Now we don't really see that anymore. Do you think internally there are still things like that going on? There are still goals that companies want to work towards to, or is it more disappeared and it's there like a tick boxing exercise, but not really lived by the company anymore?
Yeah, I do believe that they're still there. I know that the companies that I'm working with, the companies I'm talking to, are still quite aware of what their diversity goals are. Whether that means internally for departments, they're recognizing. I think we're going to see them. I think for the next couple of years, we're going to see a decline in ESG reports, identifying true numbers and benchmarking those, which is really problematic. I mean, it leads us to nothing more than groupthink. And, you know, again, to play the supply chain card, if you can't look to your supplier base to recognize those are your boots on the ground, they're the ones who are going to tell you what's happening in this different communities. Um, and when we consider procurement and sales being kind of back and opposite sides of the coin, right? Sales is certainly looking out and looking at the persona of who the customers are. And if we were to say to sales teams, I don't want you to think about the persona of the people you're selling to, I think you would absolutely see sales decline. Using that same consideration, if we are a procurement team who is not recognizing the persona of whom we are working, and we don't recognize that sales and procurement happen in an ongoing circle, whether, that's the circle of identifying customer supplier bases and how they move at minimum through the sales cycle. We're going to see savings decrease. We're going to see some big problems. I just whether you're talking about it out loud or not, you know, procurement folks have to recognize the importance or do recognize, I don't, it doesn't come from me. They do recognize the persona plays a role in the overall act of sales and supply chain. It's their job to save and it's their job to mitigate risk. They're going to continue to do it, whether they're promoting it or not. There's no other way from here to there without going through certification.
Right. And I think what you mentioned before is also that procurement has such a major role to play in a company that is not as recognized, and I would say that how it should be. I recently had a webinar with DEI specialists, and they weren't from the supply chain. And I asked how many of the attendees of my webinar do know what their company is buying. And majority did not know what their organization was buying. And I think that's also one of the issues that so many people are working in a company and are never in touch with anyone from procurement because they're just never don't ever have to get something from externally because everything is already here. They use their computers and their papers and pens and sit at the tables, but they don't know that that probably has not been manufactured
Right.
by the company, or if then something had come from somewhere. So I think that's still the case. That procurement is kind of that support function, which doesn't get the attention that I think it should get in a company. But on the other hand, also when we talk about supplier diversity and inclusion, and we also offer that steering committee lead as a service where you really make sure that you get stakeholders from the whole organization in the conversation about supplier inclusion, how I also don't want to call it a program, how your efforts are going forward, how the progress is with your supplier inclusion efforts to create impact.
You know what would be fun to do is every time we want to say the word stakeholders, say our diverse group of internal candidates, right? Right? Like we know it.
Uh-huh.
We know diversity matters. We know it. That's the reason for stakeholders. Because if you're not looking for the I mean, I'm going to use the word diverse. And diverse doesn't just mean ethnic or gender. It means different, a
Uh-huh.
different because if you don't have different, you have the same. And you know who doesn't have the same? And I'm saying this directly to all of those CPOs out there who listen to your podcast. Who does not are your competitors. Your competitors know how to use the tools, and diversity is a tool. And so sometimes I want to say two things. One is here to support any organization who wants to build out their community-based procurement initiatives and look for, non-group think and mitigate risk. That's my first. My second is to those of you who don't want to, that's okay. You can't stay in business much longer because your competitors are doing it. And again, I'm going to go back to the supply chain is built of suppliers and customers, and they talk and they know each other, and they're going to keep it going. And that's where small businesses sit. That's where diverse businesses sit. They sit in that supply chain. You can pretend they're not there, but they're there. I'm going to start saying that every time I say stakeholder, I'm going to say diverse internal candidates.
That diverse group that's
Diverse.
also in your company.
That's great.
So we have been talking for a while, and there is one more thing I want to touch, and that's that we also talked about in the webinar in 2024 was that one database, because right now it takes a lot of effort to actually find diverse owned businesses to include in your opportunities and so on. There was, I think, some conversations in the US about having that one database. In Europe, we're not really there yet. There are several different databases which try to get all the diverse owned businesses in there, also small businesses. I collaborate with a database called Go Diverse. Also have an open database for all diverse owned businesses throughout Europe, and they work with corporates who get access to them. But how is it in the US? Is there like a plan to get this one?
I don't think so, and I can't imagine that they will. I spent my career in procurement, and then in my final years, I spent with a data company, which really allowed me the clarity to know that I wanted to be a consultant and offer these services because it really just kind of firmed up my knowledge. Since then, I've become affiliated with, a handful of organizations. And, I think it's important to have a good resource to stay connected with who understands and recognizes the landscape of what is happening in the technology that's being offered to procurement. And I'm old enough to recognize I started on paper. I started before there was an internet, right? And how we did business then is very, very different than how we do business now. But, and I'm going to speak for both of us, Andrea, like staying connected to the technology landscape has to be part of our career, right? It's because if I need to be able to support my clients in what their needs and wants are, whether it's tier one or it's tier two, we need to be able to reach into our toolbox and have a sense of who are the organizations that are most current and out there that are offering, deeming the best services. And the best services for one company are not always the best services for the other. And that I think is where I'm going to say to people, reach out to consultants and get some insight because, we have our thumb on the pulse of what are the technologies out there to be supportive.
Right. And we could probably talk for another hour about AI and so on, but is there like, before we close, one last thought that you want to share?
I mean, I'm always stuck here, right? Because there's two things. I mean, certainly want to promote my business, and that's LN Westgate consulting firm. More importantly than that, I really want to speak to, the procurement teams. Do better. Simply do better. Do take that extra step to ensure that you are looking to be inclusive, that you are looking for the betterment of your community with whom you sell your goods. You should be taking those into consideration as where you procure your goods. So, it is, we have a saying here in the United States as it relates to politics, it's the economy, stupid. And I'm saying to procurement, it's the economy, stupid. It's time. That's all.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That was great last words. And I totally agree that you need to look at the company from a holistic view, right? It's clients, it's communities, it's employees, but it's also suppliers. And yeah, so thanks so much for sharing your thoughts in from today's world, how it is being in supply chain consulting, supplier inclusion consulting in the US. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Andrea.
Now, if you want to make your supply chain more inclusive, reach out via fipsconsulting.com or Fips Consulting on LinkedIn. If you're interested on education and sessions that LN Westgate and Fips Consulting is providing, reach out as well. And listening to my next episodes where I talk to more experts about supplier diversity and inclusion and the impact it has on their company. Thanks so much for listening, and bye. Responsible.